Good morning. I'm Anna Palmer, CEO and one of the founders of Punchbowl News. Thank you so much for joining us for a pop-up conversation with Senator Roy Blunt. The Republican from Missouri is leaving Congress at the end of the year after serving in the Senate since 2011 and for 14 years in the House before that. We are going to talk about news of the day, the future of democracy, voting rights reform, and much more. A big thank you to the Business and Democracy Initiative with support from Public-Private Strategies for making this conversation possible. Afterward, Brett Buttle, founder of Public-Private Strategies, and Anup Prakash, founding member of the Wisconsin Business Leaders for Democracy, will join me for a fireside chat. Just a reminder, you can find Punchbowl News on all social media platforms at Punchbowl News, and we encourage you to share about today's event. With that, I'd like to welcome Senator Blunt to the virtual stage. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Great to be with you, Anna. A lot going on, and look forward to talking to you about that.
Absolutely, never a dull moment, right, on your last month or so in office. So let's get to a few news of the day questions first. All eyes are on Georgia. We are 1 week out from that Georgia Senate runoff. If the Democrats win, they will have 51 seats in the next Congress. This would end the longest 50-50 split in Senate history, but it's been a surprisingly productive period. What's going to happen in Georgia next week, and what's your thought on that 50-50 Senate?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen in Georgia next week. I do think that generally the 50-50 Senate got some things done beyond what people would have expected. And frankly, from my side, the Republican side, I think we stopped a lot of things from happening that people absolutely would have thought 2 years ago were going to happen. As much money as was spent, there was a whole lot more money in the Build Back Better package than wound up at the end of the day being spent. That was a good thing for our economy, that we didn't dump more money on top of an economy that was already recovering. The biggest difference in a 50-50 Senate and a 50-51 Senate would be the structure of the committees, I assume. The two leaders agreed that in a 50-50 Senate, the committees would all be 50-50, and a 50-50 vote in a committee doesn't produce a result. That's in effect a vote not to move forward. And so Republicans in that 50-50 situation have been able to slow things down, sometimes stop particularly nominations from going forward. But Democrats are also able to, with slightly more effort, to eventually get all of those bills and nominations to the floor if they want to. But in a 51-49 Senate, I assume the Democrats would insist on one more vote on maybe every single committee, and that would make a difference in how those committees function. But legislatively, with a Republican House, the legislative functions won't matter as much as the other things that uniquely move through the Senate, which would be judicial nominations and, frankly, every other nomination that takes Senate confirmation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really the key here, right? I mean, whether or not you're going to have the nomination process move at a much faster speed, which the Biden administration, I'm sure, would like. I do want to ask you about one other big priority before the end of the year, which is government funding. Set to run out December 16th. We reported on Monday morning that Democrats are already looking at a new 1 week extension until December 23rd. Today, we reported this morning that the Biden administration is looking at potentially a 1-year CR, keeping all government funding at that same level. What's your take on the likelihood that Congress has to pass, a short-term funding bill instead of a larger omnibus? And can a larger omnibus come together?
Well, I think it can, and frankly, I think it should. I think in the time I've been here, the 26 years I've been in the Congress, I think the most unfortunate change in the way we do business is now coming to the end of every year with one big bill that includes both legislative activities and principally the principal work of the Congress for a couple hundred years was to set the priorities for the government by deciding how you fund the government. And right up through George W. Bush, the time I was the majority whip in the House, the appropriating process took the most time of the Congress. It was generally open to amendment and debate and public scrutiny and relatively small packages. And I think it's incredibly unfortunate that we've now into multiple years, really sort of starting at the end of the first 2 years of the Obama presidency, when the Congress changed, the president, remember, said, now I've got the phone and the pen, and legislative activity as we've known it in many ways stopped. And we get into this terrible situation where every year there's a big bill. The four leaders, the two House leaders, the two Senate principal leaders, in my view, control way too much of that process. Surely they don't want to be in that position every year, but it's not a good position to be in. Starting the new Congress with a CR that expires, I think is incredibly unfair to the next Congress, incredibly unfair to the next majority in the House and the Senate both. And I hope we find a way to get our work done. A continuation of this year's spending, everybody who believes that the principal role of the federal government is to defend the country wouldn't want to be defending the country with last year's spending numbers. The world's changed a lot since a year ago. We look at Europe differently. We look at Asia differently. We look at our defense needs differently. And passing a defense authorization bill is one thing. And we do that every year and have for almost 7 decades now, I think, certainly 6 decades. Yeah. And that says how we ought to spend our defense money. But that's really not very important unless we appropriate the defense money based on how we now think we should spend it. So I hope we don't get into either a long or short-term CR, but the clock is quickly ticking here. And that December, now we've worked here before on New Year's Eve. I hope that doesn't happen this year, but you and I have both seen that happen. And
I've been there.
It's not a pleasant way to spend the New Year's Eve, I will say that.
It is not. One quick last question on this, which is the debt limit. When you look at whether or not it should be part of a larger package, I have a hard time seeing that happen. But there has been some movement to say, especially with this new House Republican majority, having a hard time seeing that, kind of working to pass, raising the debt limit, and just the full faith and credit of the country being on the line, that maybe that should be part of a larger package. Do you think that's going to happen?
I don't think it helps a larger package get passed, and may stop a larger package from passing. It could happen, but I think it's more likely the debt limit gets carried over, and maybe even less harmful than if we carry over spending, particularly if we carry over spending into the first month or two of a new year, which is like tossing a grenade that you've already pulled the pin out into next year's Congress. And I hope we don't do that. There's obviously the debt ceiling is a challenge, but we have used the debt ceiling in the past to negotiate some spending controls that we wouldn't have had otherwise. If I had to guess, I'd guess that the debt ceiling is something they're going to have to deal with next year. And it's easier to deal with the debt ceiling than it is an actual impending government shutdown, in my view.
All right, let's move to the topic of the day, the future of democracy. You've been in Washington a long time, politics a long time, seen a lot over the course of your time here. As a baseline, on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried are you about the future of democracy?
I'm always optimistic about the country. I am not nearly as concerned as some of my colleagues are about the future of democracy. I do think it's important that we get focused right now on everything we can do to see that people have faith in what happens on Election Day, or now more and more the many days that lead up to Election Day. The expansion of the election process has happened. Unlikely that gets rolled back very much. But I think we need to figure out how to get the voting day process and the end of the election process in a much better place than it is now. Having, in some states, hundreds of thousands of votes to cast for days and days and days after the election can't be helpful. My first job as an elected official, almost 50 years ago, when I was 23, was the chief election official in the third biggest county in our state. The county clerk's job was a big job. I always thought the title didn't give the job quite all the credibility it needed. But when I saw in the last year before the election, all the county clerks in big and small counties around America being interviewed and the frontline workers. Then I was the Secretary of State, the chief election official in our state. And frankly, bringing those elections to a conclusion was, I always thought, an important, incredibly important part of that job, and having a system that works so that you had the best unofficial returns you could possibly have on election night, and people had a really good sense of how that election had worked out, and were able to move forward, as opposed to this long drawn out process now that I think states that do it that way have to look at their process and see how they can improve the way they process ballots and come up with results.
I want to ask about that, because when you look at the midterms, right, we're just a few weeks out from them. As you said, there's still some states that we're counting ballots even this week. There were many that were concerned going into the election about the transition of power, the large number of election deniers running for office. The election went off largely without problems. The transfer of power has happened. Do you think those threats, though, are real? And as much as maybe you are optimistic about the future of democracy, that is something that's concerning?
Well, I think that the importance of the fabric, of maintaining the fabric of democracy and faith in that fabric of democracy revolves around Election Day, people believing that what voters tried to do on Election Day is absolutely reflected in the results of what happens on Election Day. And I think that the fact that people largely rejected the idea that all of the last elections were somehow, without any evidence, not effectively dealt with, not fair in some way, shows that voters have more confidence in the system than some of the people that were running to take over the system, frankly, and be responsible for the system next time. You can't just make charges that the election is unfair, our voters are being disadvantaged, with no proof. Now, frankly, I think it's time for our friends on the other side, our friends the Democrats, to act like voter fraud can't happen and doesn't matter, because that's an important part of the process as well. The last time we looked at this nationally, the Carter Baker commission that looked at elections after 2000, thought that it was really important that the election rolls themselves have integrity, that people had confidence in what happened on Election Day. I don't think there's any problem at all with political monitors observing what happens at the election. But what's really important is being sure that you have people who not only are there to watch each other, but also there as election workers to protect each other. When I used to do election worker training, I said, one of your jobs at the polling place is you're there, a Republican and a Democrat, doing every job to watch each other, but you're also there to protect each other when the process is over and say, no, I didn't walk out of the room and not pay any attention. I was doing my job. My counterpart was doing their job. The election results were handled efficiently and fairly, and the American people could have confidence, or the Greene County voters could have confidence, the Missouri voters could have confidence in the result. And we need to get back to that. There was no challenge, even under the Electoral Count Act, which we need to update, I think, before this Congress ends. The Electoral Count Act, from when it was put in place in about 1888 until 2005, really never challenged the process of the elections. And then in 2005, 2021, suddenly there are enough members of both the House and the Senate, and remember, it only takes one in each the House, stepping forward and say, no, we need to go back and we need to look at this election, which has already been looked at, litigated, everything else has happened. There does need to be a verification, but it needs to be a verification in a way that makes sense to the American people and produces a process that is reasonable and protects democracy.
Yeah, I want to talk about the Electoral Count Reform Act, which you've been involved in. It's been slow moving in the Senate, but has broad bipartisan support. The House has, of course, been pushing their own legislation. How important is it that it gets done before the end of the year? Hard to see that a Republican House would support something like this.
Well, I do think it needs to get done before the end of the year. I'm sorry that that we're this far into the year without getting it done, but the long process did produce a pretty dramatic bipartisan consensus on the things that need to be done to make that 1888 law work better. One of which would just be to take more than one member of the House and one member of the Senate to totally take the whole process back in from the joint session into two separate meetings to slow that down in ways that really didn't produce any questions about the election itself, but produced a lot of questions about how much power the Congress had to reverse the results that the states had certified. I think 37 co-sponsors in the Senate, both the minority and the majority leader are co-sponsors. Senator Klobuchar and I are the lead Democrat and lead Republican on the Rules Committee, the Committee of Jurisdiction here. A great bipartisan group put this together. We had a hearing. It's time now to have a vote, and I believe we'll get that done before the end of the year.
Before I let you go, you are leaving a Senate that is very evenly divided, that Democrats control, and a House that has a very narrow Republican majority. What role do you think Congress has in terms of protecting democratic institutions? Is there anything more beyond the revision of the Electoral Reform Act that needs to happen, that you would kind of tell your colleagues on the way out, this is something that you think also would be helpful?
Well, I think reforming that act will matter, but I've chaired the last two inaugurations, the one with President Trump, the one with President Biden. I've been in one of the four members responsible for counting these electoral votes the last two times. So I've thought a lot about the importance of the transition of power. The peaceful transition of power is maybe the greatest gift our country gives to the world. I remember President Reagan's comment in 1981, what we do here today is both commonplace and miraculous. Commonplace because we've done it every 4 years since 1789. Miraculous because we've done it every 4 years since 1789. 100 million people watch that event live. Millions and millions more watch it all over the world. It's important that we continue to protect that example and that gift to the world of what a democracy really does and looks like. I think our country continues to be committed to that as we try to find a more perfect union. It's interesting, the Constitution didn't promise a perfect union. It just promised a country that would continue to try to do better than we have been before, and I hope we continue to do that.
All right, Senator Blunt. Unfortunately, we are all out of time. I really appreciate you taking the time this morning to speak with us, and I hope you have a great rest of the year before your end of.
I've loved doing it. I look forward to the rest of the year, and then I look forward to whatever comes next. Anna, great to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right. Now I'd like to welcome Rhett Buttle, founder of Public-Private Strategies, and Anup Prakash, founding member of the Wisconsin Business Leaders for Democracy, to join me for a fireside chat. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Hey, Anna, thanks for having us.
All right. Before we get into kind of the meat of the discussion here in this fireside chat, I just want each of you to do a quick introduction of kind of your organization and the vantage point where you take on this issue of kind of the future of democracy. Rhett, why don't I start with you?
Sure. Public-Private Strategies is an organization that works with business leaders to help them get engaged on society's most pressing issues in public policy. And we're proud to be a founding member of the Business and Democracy Initiative. We founded this initiative with the Leadership Now Project and the Black Economic Alliance, which are two other business organizations. And now we're working with 40 other business organizations to really make sure businesses are invested in defending our democratic institutions, because we know strong democratic institutions and safe and secure elections are also important for the economy.
Anup, we'll go to you.
Yeah, sure. Well, Wisconsin Business Leaders for Democracy formed about 18 months ago by a number of business leaders here in Wisconsin that were concerned, rightfully about democracy and a lot of the election denialism here in Wisconsin at the time. Since then, we've kind of morphed into organizing a number of our business associations and leaders in areas of civic engagement, supporting election officials, and seeking pledges to support democracy from candidates in this last midterms. And so it's formed, we've got a lot of momentum and continue to look at how we can hold the line on democracy and economic stability.
I want to start with the future of democracy. We heard Senator Blunt give his assessment, fairly, wanting to be optimistic about it, talking about the need for fair elections and for kind of Republicans and Democrats to certify elections, to work together at that local level. What did you see in Wisconsin? Do you agree with his kind of assessment, or did you see something different happening on the ground?
I think I would say everyone in business is also an optimist. I don't think you can survive in Congress or business without being an optimist. But I think what it requires also is that we're active. And I think what Senator Blunt pointed out is that there was a lot of bad actors and bad information going around in the last election, and without a check on that, some kind of accountability to that. It can continue to manifest itself and really take over and put us all in jeopardy. And as a business leader, our goals are to mitigate risk and make sure that the economy is stable. And when you start to see institutions getting undermined and elections getting undermined, you see that really as mitigating risk. I mean, it's a very natural place for business leaders to participate. And I think these midterms really woke up business leaders around the country to see the risk. And you saw, not only in Wisconsin, but in Michigan and Ohio, other key states, that business leaders and chambers started to step up and take whatever actions they could in a bipartisan manner in most cases to say, look, don't cross this line. And I think that local action is really important to really hold that line.
Rhett, I want to turn to you and kind of ask you that question at the kind of more broader kind of scope from your vantage point, but then also kind of dial into this idea around the significant number of election deniers on the ballot. A peaceful transfer of power largely has occurred. It hasn't been as dramatic as I think a lot of people feared. What do you see? How do you see that playing out?
Well, look, I think a lot of us are optimistic. A lot of folks have, obviously, we all breathed a big sigh of relief after the midterm elections. But the reality is there were more election deniers on the ballot than ever before. And I think that the risk that you're hearing Anoop talk a lot about has become something that has drawn the attention of the business community. This became really relevant for me in the work that I was doing, quite frankly, around the presidential election, when I started hearing from a number of, business leaders, both CEOs and leaders of business associations, when President Trump really started with dangerous rhetoric even before the presidential election was called. And I think it was then that a lot of business leaders really started to dial in on this. And we saw, over the last few months, as we've sort of shepherded towards the midterm, some of that rhetoric really dialed up that has been dangerous. And I think for, the business community who increasingly not only views rhetoric like that or challenges to our institution as risk as it relates to the economy, they're also, quite frankly, hearing from their employees and their communities. Now more than ever, people are looking to business leaders as a trusted source and institution for information. And I think there's a really important role that business leaders can play, both their employees and their communities. And so as they've been trying to work through these issues and hearing, from folks who've either been sort of using rhetoric that hasn't been helpful, I think business has been really focused on the role that they can play. And we've really started to see that activation, starting really with the last presidential election, but building up through the midterms.
Yeah, and maybe we just follow up on that because, we at Punchbowl News often we're covering the lawmakers, we're covering Congress, we're covering the administration and their role. But there is what you all are talking about, and we talked earlier with Senator Blunt about the Congress's role, right? What is the role of business here? It does seem as though we've kind of shifted into in some instances where business leaders or executives are becoming much more active when it comes to kind of the larger issue of democracy.
Well, I think the role has shifted, in this last cycle. And I think it was a bit of a waking up of a sleeping giant. You had business really playing a very passive role historically, really just focused on their own, specific business issues for their industry or their company, focused on supporting candidates and or associations that really were, anti-taxes or wanted to, remove regulations. And that was a really easy role for business to play. And it was a very passive role. But when you start to see risks of democracy and the undermining of institutions and the undermining of, the economy in a local region, businesses start to wake up and say, this is not good for my business. We're again going back to our role of mitigating risk and making sure there's conditions for growth. And I think that has really woken up business to say, once, Congress and others and at the local level start to talk about things that are outside the role of government and start to undermine institutions that hold our economy together and our country together, that's when business steps up and has to play a role. And that can happen in a bipartisan way. Business is by its nature bipartisan. It is not meant to be partisan. It doesn't play well when it's partisan. But in a bipartisan way, we can support election administration that is nonpartisan. We can support civic engagement and making sure that people are aware of the issues and that they're voting. And we can support candidates that are going to pledge to uphold democracy. And I think that's really the role of business as we go forward.
We are quickly running out of time, but Rhett, I want to go to you on just the Electoral Count Reform Act. We heard Senator Blunt, who's been a key advocate, supporting that, talking about how he hopes it's going to get done. The end of the year, things always are in flux. We've been reporting a bunch of that on the twists and turns. But from your perspective, what would your message be to Congress about why this should get done before the end of the year?
Yeah, I would make the case that this is not only an important issue for our democracy, but also, quite frankly, an economic issue. There's a lot of important things that need to get done before the end of the year. As we heard a lot about this morning, there's a lot of conversations going on between the White House and Congress right now about how we settle on the budget. But the reality is that the Electoral Count Act, which has garnered strong bipartisan support, really has the opportunity to pass this Congress. And so we really encourage policymakers to think about this not only as an issue that's important for our democracy, but also, quite frankly, for our economy, because the two are really attached. And so we're optimistic. I think we heard from Senator Blunt that it has a good chance on the Senate side. I think it's important that it passes the House in this session before they move into the next Congress.
Anoop, I'm going to give you the last word. This is a question we often tee up to folks who aren't in Washington all day long, like myself and Rhett, which is, if there was one thing that you wanted to have lawmakers, their staffs, the folks that are listening to this, one message that coming from outside of Washington to hear on this issue, what would it be?
I think I would say that there are so many things happening in Washington to shape the debate around like Electoral Count Act, as we just spoke about. I think what I would encourage folks in Washington to do is, especially those who are working in the field, working at the state level, at the county level, and at the local level, is to engage their local business leaders and start to have a dialogue with them about how they can partner with associations, NGOs, others who are involved in the day-to-day, kind of political establishment in any kind of in any region, because I think business leaders had been on the sidelines and were only approached for maybe contributions or donations or financial support. But I think at this point, those voices are really important. As Rhett pointed out, they're trusted, and if local partners can combine forces with business leaders, I think a lot can get done to drive both our economy and our democracy forward.
All right, we will leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it. Unfortunately, we are all out of time. Thank you so much for joining me. A big thank you to Senator Roy Blunt and his staff for making this conversation possible, as well as to the Democracy Initiative with support from Public-Private Strategies. We have several other events in December, including an event next week in person with Mr. Smith. You can go to our events hub at punchbowl.news and check out all of our events before the end of the year. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day and stay safe.